Good afternoon, we're just going to get started. My name is Haley Stamma from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. On behalf of all the hosting organizations, we'd like to thank you for coming today. We'd also like to extend special thanks to the California Latino Legislative Caucus for co-sponsoring this briefing, and thank you also to the LGBTQ Caucus for their help today. It is easy to think about online or digital speech solely as a tech issue, but in truth, protecting the ways we communicate and access information online is important to everyone, and especially to those advocating and organizing right now to protect communities that have been singled out by the incoming Trump administration. Our esteemed panel today will talk about the ways, our esteemed panel today has firsthand knowledge about the ways social media and online presence affect immigrants, adolescent health, people seeking reproductive care, LGBTQ people, activists, and others. They'll speak about how proposals they've seen in this space affect their communities, and they'll also articulate what they hope to see in the future. We will leave some time for questions for those in the room. If you have a question, please pass it to David Kaiser, who is around. Oh, there she is, waving in the back. For those joining us online, I'm afraid we don't have the staffing to take questions from you today, but anyone with follow-ups should please reach out to any of the folks listed on the invite. We want this conversation to be the first of many, so let's get going. I'll turn it over to our moderator, Kari.
Hi. My name is Kari Johnson. I'm a tech reporter for Cal Matters, and between age verification, cyberbullying, misinformation, online speech issues that are important to LGBT people, people who are immigrants, there are a lot of perspectives on these topics, but where nuance came up a lot in the conversations that we had in preparation for this panel. And so we're going to try to unpack some of that today. I'll leave introductions to the esteemed panel and just dive right in. We'll have 10 minutes for questions afterwards, so please, if anything, hits a nerve with you that you think we should be discussing further, please share that. We're going to start off with Levine. Can you tell us about yourself and how has online speech legislation intersected with your work?
Thank you so much, and happy to be here, and thank you all for coming. So I'm Deb Levine, she, her, and I wear many hats. I'm the Senior Program Officer at the Gender Equity Unit working in health data at Johns Hopkins University, Bloomberg School of Public Health. And I'm also the founder and former executive director of YTH, which is Youth Tech Health, an organization working towards improving access to health services through technology. And I'm also a board member at yuki.org, which is the first user-developed period tracker that provides access to abortion services without leaving a digital footprint. So the online access and privacy really intersects my work in two main ways. And I'm going to start with the obvious. In the post-Wrobi Wade era, we're deeply concerned about abortion surveillance. The monitoring of people's reproductive choices to enforce anti-abortion laws and investigate and or criminalize people suspected of having abortions, performing abortions, or assisting people who want to have abortions in states where it's illegal. So as you know, California is a sanctuary state, and so what we're really talking about is people who are looking for information, knowledge, and access to services in our state from other states, and providing personal identifying information online that may be misused, mishandled, and or misrepresented and criminalized. But really, in addition to that, the other way that this digital free speech and online speech and privacy interacts with my work is because I firmly believe that all young people need access to knowledge, information, and services about their own health so that they can be informed consumers, right? So that they can have all that information out there and they can make decisions for themselves. At YTH, we did research studies where we walked around the state and basically traveled and talked to young people, and the big question was, where do you learn about sex? When you have a burning question about your sex life, your relationships, where do you go? And the number one answer, you want to take a guess? Google, okay? They go to Google. Most of the time, that's fine. They go to Google, they go to a website, and they find out the information that they want, right? However, now websites are asking you to enter a lot of information. And they're just like, oh yeah, here's my name, here's how old I am, here's where I live, here's what my mom does. All of that information is being collected. And if they don't want to enter that information, they may not be able to have the access that they need in order to improve their own health and well-being. The research that we did, we talked to both housed youth and marginally housed youth and unhoused youth, youth who are in school, youth who are systems involved, youth who are differently abled and able-bodied, and they trust the internet, and they trust that as a source. All people need safe and anonymous places online where they can ask their most personal questions without fear of investigation or criminalization. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. And Sean, can you tell us a bit about yourself and how online speech intersects with your work?
Yeah, thank you, Barry. And thank you, Deb. That was really important context. That's really great. So I'm Dr. Sean Gamble, he, him, and I'm a pediatrician with Stanford University. Quick disclaimer, I'm here in my personal capacity today. These are my views and not those of my employers. And so how I fit in here today is that as a pediatrician, I work every day directly with young people and their families, supporting their overall health and well-being. I'm also a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics Council on Communications and Media, which has been increasingly focused on intersections of digital media, social media, and adolescent health. And I'm currently working with Stanford Medicine colleagues to develop new curricula to train young doctors on how to effectively translate issues that we see in our practice into systemic legal and policy change. Further, personally, I am a parent of a middle school-age child who has joined us in the back row, and today is a field trip day. This is life education, so we're happy to have you here with us. So in my work life and my home life, I'm engaged in significant discussion about digital technology and its potential to benefit young people's development and also potentially expose them to harms. So I'm really glad to be here with everyone today. As we consider more ways to work together to build bridges from the lived experience of young people, research on technology and adolescent health, and legal and policy interventions that can better protect the health and well-being of diverse young people. So thank you for inviting me to join this really timely discussion today. So from the perspective of my work, it's clear that digital technology is a really significant part of young people's lives. It's here to stay. And so we recognize some real potential positives for social learning and connectedness, for access to information and resources. So for example, in a 2023 national survey, they found that a majority of young people felt that social media fosters connection and combats feelings of loneliness. And the numbers are even higher for LGBTQ youth, 74%. More than half of all social media users aged 14 to 22 also said that social media platforms are important for seeking support or advice when they need it. But we know from the surveys and the research, and for me, for the young people that I see as patients, that there are some real challenges and risks for harms. So the potential for cyberbullying and attacks on identity, issues of privacy and overuse that can be driven by the surveillance business model employed by tech companies, trying to get users online on their platforms, staying on their platforms as long as possible to extract information from them for profit. So we're dealing with really complex issues here, and in terms of the potential benefits and harms. And this can be very different for even young people of the same age, based on their developmental stage. And so certainly even more nuanced in terms of different stages of development chronologically, from younger children to elementary school age to teens to young adults. So within the American Academy of Pediatrics, the AAP, we as pediatricians, we're trying to shift away from sort of this one-size-fits-all, screen time is bad kind of narrative, to one that centers on young people's lived experiences and their agency. So using much more of an approach like we use in other contexts for young people's development. So, for example, learning to drive a car. Like social media and other technology, driving a car presents both potential benefits for young people, but also potential risks. And so we understand that new drivers benefit from initial education and periods of supervision and boundaries, and of course safety features built into the cars that protect all users. And so my interaction with online speech regulation as a pediatrician, I'm hoping to see fewer bills that can be challenged on First Amendment grounds and get tied up in litigation for years, and that aren't helping young people during that time. And more policy work that can get to work right away, that reinforces young people being in the position to have true agency based on their own lived circumstances. And then strong privacy protections that get at the root of the surveillance business models that result in a lot of these downstream effects. And I just wrote a commentary about these issues in the Journal of Adolescent Health, and that's included in your supplemental materials. So I'd like to pass it to present.
Yeah, no, as a parent of a teenager as well, I know it's challenging to strike that balance between put that phone down, screen time is bad, but also your school gave you a Chromebook, so go do your homework. Jackie, given the recent election, what are the issues that are top of mind for you, and as you think about online speech in your communities?
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. Thank you to all the panelists. I'm Renee. I am certainly a parent that says screen time is bad because you're on Duolingo learning Spanish. So hopefully I'll take away some tidbits for better parenting, always looking to improve in that aspect of my life. But I am the policy director at Immigrant Defense Advocates. I am an immigration attorney by training, so practiced for about a decade doing removal defense, deportation defense, and now I do policy work here in Sacramento. In Sacramento, a lot of my work is focused on privacy, or I shouldn't say privacy, I would say the private use detention centers and the profiteering through private prison companies. I certainly do not hold myself out to be an expert on privacy like my esteemed colleagues here, but I am very concerned about the use of surveillance, which I think is a common thread through the comments that have been presented here today. And when I say that, I mean both at the level of the non-citizen who is being surveilled, and then also people who are assisting non-citizens. So we saw during Trump 1.0, and I can say this from firsthand experience when I represented people, and I will never forget the first time I was in court and I had opposing counsel bring out someone's Facebook account to start sort of impeaching their credibility. I was certainly taken aback. I was a very young attorney, and I think the use of that, even at that time, wasn't as sort of prevalent as it is today. But at an individual level, we know that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the Department of Homeland Security, their budget is now at the same level of the FBI for private surveillance, which is just horrifying. Because there is very little regulation on how far and how deep they can use surveillance on individuals through a loophole known as investigating some type of criminal activity, right? There's not a lot of accountability. So there's very heavy surveillance at an individual level of non-citizens, both when they are trying to protect themselves from deportation, and I think also when they're seeking affirmative benefits, whether it's becoming a citizen of the United States, applying for asylum, we see routinely the use of this at an individual level. At a macro level, we saw also during Trump 1.0 heavy surveillance of individuals serving this population. You all may recall the really abhorrent practice of family separation, and the national outcry by not just service providers, but really the community against this practice. And through different, requests for information and like Freedom of Information Act requests, the community learned that they were being surveilled at protests. People were targeted, journalists, lawyers who were serving immigrants. There was like a private company in Virginia that I think surveilled over 600 protests against family separation. So I think the sort of digital footprint that we all leave behind as a non-citizen or as a service provider is really just horrifying. And I think in this administration, we should be prepared to see much more of that. Like I mentioned earlier, and this may not be common knowledge, but in the state of California, the detention of individuals is run solely by private corporations. That's the physical detention. The surveillance that I was just mentioning has really also been highly outsourced to private companies by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And this issue, and perhaps this will come up in other comments, but the issue of data brokers and the use, just the amount of information that they can cull that an individual isn't even necessarily aware, right, that they're not affirmatively providing, but that information isn't subject to the same level of oversight than when a government entity, right, is seeking information from an individual. So what we have seen happen is the outsourcing of data collection on non-citizens to these companies, who then pull data anywhere from, a person being online trying to access legal resources or information to court dates, when an individual is being released, for example. If an individual may be incarcerated, they serve their time and they're then being released back to their community, they will go as far as providing data about the release date of that individual, which then enables ICE to appear and arrest that person. For those of you who are less familiar with California's laws, this is really a way to get around California's sanctuary law. So we have a lot of protections in place in California to ensure that there is not cooperation between law enforcement and ICE in transferring people over to that entity, but these data brokerage companies really circumvent that and provide data that otherwise wouldn't be available, and sort of skirts around this interaction that otherwise we as a state, and not just California, but many states and localities are trying to prevent. So that's just sort of a few of the things that I'm concerned about. I think in terms of what we would like to see, certainly on the physical incarceration of individuals, we tried a lot as a state to push back on the privatization and profiteering of this. I think on the data broker companies engaging in this activity, I think that's an area, and again, I'm not an expert, but I think it's an area where there could be stronger protections and regulations to ensure that when people are not even just trying to access legal resources and information, but just going about their daily lives, that there are better systems for, curtailing that information, erasing some of those places. And the final piece, and this makes a little technical, but the use of, I think, not physical detention, but what we call e-carceration. Now there are proposals this exists that you can be monitored either through like an ankle bracelet or some type of other device. And while for myself personally, I don't support any of those things, some people might think that that's a better alternative, obviously, than being physically detained. But the practice of that, we also are seeing grow at an exponential rate. And when a person subjects themselves to that type of monitoring, they give up a lot of rights, and then they further expose the individuals that they interact with. Unwittingly, those individuals now sort of get put on the radar, right? Whether it's at work or at home or in the community.
Now the tracking.
Now they can track, right? Just like the physical location.
Yeah.
So those are just some
Yeah.
of the concerns that I think we have been.
Thank you, Jackie. I think you mentioned, just for context, I'm curious, info shared online in social media coming up in court. When did that be? You mentioned this incident with one of your clients and Facebook being used. When was that?
I mean, that example honestly is, I want to say from 7, 8 years ago, but that practice now is very routine, and I think it's really just used to impeach someone's like credibility at every level. Like you were here on this date, or intimidation. Like you said, you didn't have any siblings, but we see that you have a sibling and trying to get at like undocumented family members. So a host of things that we know for the immigrant community, not just social media is a way to stay connected across borders. Certainly, I mean, we all have it, like to the point about socialization and community, but I think more so for the immigrant population, so much does happen on social media and then on cell phones specifically, not to get into that whole thing with the tracking of someone's physical location. These private companies too now, there's some that are just dedicated to the tracking of individuals via their cell phones. And we know that that's how a lot of people obtain information, more so than the use of a physical computer.
Yeah, and again, for context, when you're talking about circumventing sanctuary laws through buying information from data brokers in your practice, when did you see that become sort of common practice in federal agencies?
I mean, I can't say I experienced that directly. I just know that it's a practice.
Yeah.
And I think there's a host of individuals that wouldn't otherwise be caught up in that dragnet before that information being relayed. And so these companies aren't subject to Freedom of Information Act requests, for example, that we can say, okay, give up the list of people that you're giving over to the federal government. And the Department of Homeland Security and ICE has created basically this whole state and arm of surveillance that they really couldn't operate themselves, and certainly not lawfully, if they didn't outsource it all.
Sorry, Debbie, you guys say something?
I would love to add on to that, that it's a very similar situation around abortion surveillance. And so you mentioned basically the federal government using data brokers, and in abortion surveillance, the issue is that the federal government has given all the information, all the rights and power to the states. And in states where abortion is illegal, they also have access to this data about who are seeking accessing abortion in our state where it is legal, where and putting at risk our health providers, putting at risk anyone online who's sort of helping someone cross state lines, and maybe just by getting somebody's travel information, right, and their flight information and travel patterns. So the data brokers worry me as well. Thank you.
And before we move on to the next question, Maggie or Sean, any thoughts as well on the issues that are top of mind for you? Think about online speech in your communities.
Yeah, definitely. So my name is Wrobi, my pronouns are they, them. I work with TransFamily Support Services. We're a nonprofit that works with trans youth and their families in order to sort of assist with the full spectrum of the gender journey, whether that is support at schools or family engagement sessions, insurance navigations for accessing gender-affirming care. We really do the full spectrum of helping trans youth, get the resources that they need. And a lot of the ways that we see, trans youth and LGBTQ youth in general accessing the internet and online spaces is as a source of education, and then also as a place for building community. And so, we are seeing that upwards of 95% of LGBTQ youth use the internet specifically to learn about their identities. And this is something that I myself have experience with. I came out in 2010, and at the time there was not nearly as much information as there is now about trans identities. But the first time that I ever heard the term trans, it was used in a derogatory way, and the internet was the first place that told me, this is actually a thing. You're not broken. You're not alone. This is an entire community. And we are seeing that, a lot of our youth today exist in the same spaces to the point that 68% of LGBTQ youth have affirming spaces online, compared to only 54% who have affirming spaces at schools and 38% who have affirming spaces at home. So we are really seeing that online spaces tend to be the most affirming for our youth, who often don't have supportive households or who have geographical constraints, growing up in small towns that maybe don't necessarily have a broad LGBTQ community. And so online really is the first time that we get to really be ourselves. Our organization, we run a Discord server specifically for LGBTQ youth for middle school, high school, and young adult. We have separate servers that really give youth a chance to talk about their euphoria, to talk about their dysphoria, to talk about their concerns with the rise in anti-LGBTQ legislation. We're seeing that 2 in 3 LGBTQ youth are experiencing a sharp decline in their mental health as we are seeing more and more anti-LGBTQ legislation specifically. Something that I wanted to mention on the topic of the recent election. For those who don't know, the Trevor Project is a crisis intervention nonprofit that works with the LGBTQ community. And the day after the election, they experienced a 700% increase in communications of LGBTQ youth who are experiencing active crisis because of the election. One of the 3 ways that people access the Trevor Project is online chats. Which means that the digital rights legislations that are attempting to sort of help our youth by, creating a identity verification, age verification, parental consent, would actually make it harder for youth in crisis to access the services that they need. And because of that, we really don't want to take away the few spaces that LGBTQ youth have to really receive the support that they need. Part of Project 2025 and the targeting of our youth that we're seeing takes place in schools. Forced outing policies are being implemented across the country, and for those who don't know, that is where teachers are being required to out any students who are out at school. That would be students who use a different name or different pronouns, folks who present, in a different way than maybe what's supposed to be aligned. When I was in high school, there were times when I would, leave the house dressed in one way, I would change at school. If a teacher really picked up on that, they would have to notify the parents. And this really makes it so much harder for LGBTQ youth to express themselves anywhere that is, with their friends or with trusted adults, teachers at schools. They don't really have this opportunity anymore. And so a lot of youth are using online spaces as an avenue of self-expression, as a place where they get to be who they really are, that they don't have a place for anywhere else. 3/4, so 75% of youth, of LGBTQ youth are more honest and more authentic online than anywhere else. And so that means that these online spaces become absolutely crucial for getting to just be. The first time that I ever used, my chosen was online. The first time that I ever got to explore different pronouns was online. And we've also seen Don't Say Gay bills, which are working to ban LGBTQ curriculum, as well as even just any books that, talk about LGBTQ identities, which means that in a lot of spaces, you can't even read books that are fiction that feature characters like them. There was even a famous, debate over banning a book that was for children that was about two penguin dads who had a kid, and that was too queer for the schools apparently. And also same with queer sex ed. A lot of schools don't even have any sort of robust queer sex ed to speak of. But 80% of LGBTQ youth access queer sex ed online. which means that if we were to really talk about, putting in restrictions for age verification, parental consent, like I mentioned, like this really does limit and create all of these barriers that cause a lot of damage to the mental and physical health of our youth. Something I wanted to mention is, I talked a little bit about like how we, see these unsupported households, but it's not just that, our youth have households that are unsupportive. A lot of our youth have households that are abusive, and that would cause like drastic harm if their identity was to be discovered. Some of our biggest LGBTQ resource sites have quick escape options or shortcuts. So a lot of our resource sites will have like a click, the escape key 3 times, and it takes you to Google. It kind of erases the button. You can't click the back page or whatever to get to it, because they know that the youth could be put in harm's way just by looking at resources about what it means to be LGBTQ. And so by creating these, while legislation tends to be well-meaning in the sense that it wants parental consent to be a positive thing, these digital spaces are working to navigate around unsupported households, and so putting the spear back into the unsupported household really just limits that. And then the other point that I wanted to make about age verification, there's a really big question right now about, at what age does an LGBTQ person get to do X, Y, Z? So gender affirming care is a big question right now about like at what age are we allowed to access this? At what age can we read the book about the 2 penguin dads? And by a lot of these, this legislation being very broad, very vague, it's really putting like this open-ended question that future legislators get to decide. What is that age range? And that just leaves opens the door for starting to restrict and limit our community like at earlier and earlier ages, and to the point that we just don't get to explore our identities at all. We don't get to see our identities at all, or exist in a community at all. And so, yeah, a lot of these things are just, we know that our youth are feeling very scared, very hopeless right now because of everything that they're seeing coming up. And, the main reason that we know this is because they're talking about it online. So making sure that they still have access to these spaces is absolutely crucial, across the board.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for sharing, your own perspective and experiences. What type of policy and legislative solutions would you like to see in the digital space?
Yeah, absolutely.
What missed opportunities have you seen in attempts to protect kids or fight misinformation?
Yeah, so I actually think that one of the most topical examples right now is what's happening with Meta. I don't know if everyone else has seen it, but currently Meta, Facebook, and Instagram are removing a lot of their hate speech protections. This is something that we also saw with Twitter, and what they're doing is basically making it so that you can't report certain hate speech because it's just not really considered hate speech, quote unquote. So for instance, you can say now on Facebook and Instagram, you can refer to trans people as freaks. You can say that trans people are mentally ill, that they're abnormal. There's just there's so much derogatory speech. Also, misogynistic speech and racist speech that is now there's no protection for it in the sense that you just can't report it, you can't take it down, there's no rights for that. And I would say that when they were listing the reason why they made this switch, what they specifically said was if it can be said on the floor of Congress, it should be allowed on our platforms. And I just think that that's really, it just speaks to how scary this new administration is and what implications that's going to have, not just, in the legislative realm, but, down to our, online spaces. So something that I think, looking directly at that would be helpful is if we're really looking to protect youth and young people online, then curbing cyberbullying at the source, going on these social media sites and creating stronger protections for marginalized communities would be a great place to really start, to put our focus. Instead of dialing back all of these protections, why don't we create legislation that actually regulates it? And puts it so that you're not penalizing the people who are often the victims of these sort of hate, this hate, but are actually targeting the people who intend to do harm. I also think that we've already seen some protections being put in place in the digital realm. This 2023 AB 223 by Chris Ward, that's a bill that TransFamily Support Services sponsored. That's the Trans Youth Privacy Act. And that bill specifically seals the name and gender marker changes of trans youth because those were accessible online, and something that you could just Google search and essentially find if somebody was trans. And so by creating privacy in this regard, by really pushing for how can we protect trans and LGBTQ youth specifically by limiting access to them and not limiting the access that they can have. And then the last point that I wanted to make was just that I think I mentioned that we have these Discord servers that we run. We do Zoom meetups too for youth that include movie nights and makeup tutorials and trivia nights and stuff like that. We have monitoring and vetting that happens in these online spaces. We vet in terms of having an interview with someone that doesn't require parental consent. It doesn't require age verification. It just requires conversation with that person. Additionally, these are monitored by servers are monitored by LGBTQ young adults, and so that means that our community, we trust our community to keep our community safe. And so if we wanted to start putting more funding and more resources into allowing our community to actually take the charge when it comes to protecting us, I think that would be a really good place to start.
Thank you. And to the rest of the panel, what types of policy in the digital speech space would you like to see? Any thoughts?
Okay, thank you. Thanks for asking. And Mari, I love all your ideas. So, and just building off of them a little bit to say, I keep thinking that we're all asked to read the terms of service for every different website, AI platform, anything that we use, social media. And I mean, how many of us have actually read those? Okay, so if you're at EFF and ACLU, do not raise your hand, because I know you're a geek. But the rest of us do not read those, right? So what I'd really love to see is, standardized policies that, I mean, in my dream, it's 3 bullet points that are understandable, that actually clarify that they're only collecting the information that they need to collect for the purposes of using that particular platform or website. And then this is how they're going to be using the information. Sale of information should be regulated as far as the data brokers, etc. And then how to reach customer service. If you have some, if you have issues, or if you feel that there's been a data privacy breach, there's actually no way to reach most of these platforms to speak to them, right? 3 bullet points, policy regulation, high level that everybody understands. And that they can, we can look at the reading levels, we can set that so a 13-year-old understands it, right? It's, this is not rocket science. So that's one thing I would really love to see to protect all of us, people of all ages, from unknowingly giving away personal identifying information to people for nefarious use. And then I'd also, so that's sort of on my one sort of bucket list, and then the other one is around media literacy. I would just love to see media literacy added to our ed code and to our social studies curriculums in California. This is about, you know, bringing up people and informed young people in the digital age so that as they mature into adulthood, they're also informed consumers and understand what questions to ask and what they're using and how they're using it. I heard a funny piece on NPR the other day with Pete Buttigieg as he was sort of leaving, you know, his post. And he said that social media has made everybody a reporter, right? So that's kind of great, right? We've uplifted invisible voices or formerly invisible voices, and we really, we can drill down at the community level, right? To see what's happening across the street from you, which you might not have known before. But the problem is, this is a new arena, especially in journalism, where there's not an editor, right? So we don't actually, like, there's nobody saying, is this truth or fiction? And so that's why I'm thinking that youth really need this skills-based training on media literacy so that they can become informed consumers. So that's my soapbox.
Thank you. Anything to add, Jackie or Sean, from your perspectives? We'll jump to this last question, and then, of course, I was mentioning if there are any questions from the audience, we can get into those. Sean, where do you look to for good analysis of political speech issues? Are there any reports you recommend?
Yeah, well, fortunately, there are a lot of good resources, and we've put a number of them in the supplemental materials packet that you all hopefully received. And so, you know, I had talked a little bit earlier, excuse me, about some of the work coming out of the American Academy of Pediatrics, their new National Center of Excellence on Social Media. And so what they're doing is they're collecting questions from parents and teens and educators and policymakers, and they're trying to come up with evidence-based answers that really, you know, highlight best practices, that highlight, you know, ways in which we can really promote, you know, healthy use for young people and mitigate some of these harms. And the AAP has also created a specific resource, the Family Media Plan, that can help all of us parents, you know, with our young people who, you know, again, are wanting to use these services, but again, these online platforms are engineered in such a way that they're encouraging potentially overuse or problematic use. And so, so the Family Media Plan is a customizable plan that you can go on and you can search for it on the American Academy of Pediatrics website or on Google, and families can create customized plans that work for them, that will help families, you know, have healthy use and avoid some of these harms. You know, one of the interesting points that came out was in looking at you know, problematic use for young people. The biggest predictor of youth mental health problems was not, you know, how much the child was using the service. It was actually how much the parent was using it. So if you have parents that are, you know, that are addicted to these sites and they're on, you know, it really highlights that the parent-child relationship is a really, you know, foundational thing that, you know, still matters in children's lives. And so, you know, we as parents, you know, when we're confronting our, you know, our own children and trying to figure out, you know, what are the right boundaries, you know, the basics that we already know that, you know, are really important in terms of, you know, being there, being you know, having the trust of your child, being there for them emotionally and being a good resource. And so some of the other statistics that I was citing in, you know, when I spoke earlier, were in the Common Sense Media and Hope Lab report, and we enclosed that. There was also a really strong report this past summer from the Biden-Harris administration, their task force on kids' online health and safety. And that, you know, these materials were, you know, pointed the way for, you know, for potentially, you know, industry best practices, and also for policymakers with, with suggestions for how to regulate in a way that could be really effective. These materials can help craft policy actions to support research, including youth participatory research, which is really important, and evidence-based interventions for greater health and well-being in the digital age. And so I encourage you to make use of all of those materials that were in place.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, and I encountered, I was reporting on desire for like social media bans in schools, smartphone bans in schools last year, and certainly in conversations with teachers and principals ran into a lot of what parents actually how to role play. One thing I was curious with while you were talking, I know that the book The Anxious Generation got a lot of play last year, and I think one of the things that comes up in that is the idea of what is it, like kids shouldn't have smartphones until they're 16, I believe, or something along those lines. And I was just curious what your thoughts were on that and what work you've been doing.
It's hard because, developmentally, kids of the same age can be of, at different developmental levels. And so it's really hard to come up with this one-size-fits-all solution, and going, it's like age verifications and when are people ready to read the book about penguins? And it's, a lot of the adolescent health research that's coming out really paints a picture of nuance and complexity that different kids are different, and that we need to meet the young person where they are.
Yeah, thank you. Jumping into some of the questions from the audience, if restricting speech won't help marginalized groups, what should legislatures be thinking about doing?
Processing all the negatives in that. Please repeat.
Yeah, if restricting speech won't help marginalized groups, what should legislators be thinking about doing?
Well, there's two parts to this, to my answer in any case. So one is building off of what you were speaking about, Sean and Dr. Daniel, was that, youth need to be participating in these decisions making. So to the legislators, what I really ask is include the communities, whether it be youth, whether it be immigrants, whether it be immigrant youth, whether it be LGBTQ youth. So include them in the processes so they can actually talk about their experiences, their lived experiences, and what they would like to see in terms of legislation and regulation, if any, right? And understand their perspective. And then the second part is really around back to media literacy, and really just being able to provide some legislation so that we can all actually understand as we're growing up and maturing how to read what's out there and what the possibilities are, positive, the opportunities and the challenges, right, and become informed consumers.
Yeah, those were both really great points. And the only thing that I have to add is that I think that policymakers and regulators have a role to play in with the businesses themselves, and trying to help nudge these companies in directions that can promote healthy use and mitigate some of these risks. And so those are great points.
Thank you.
I think in the immigration context, one of the things that comes up, came up even last week, we began to see enforcement and raids in the Central Valley region of the state and in other cities, is there the journalism and reporting, right? And I think there's a desire from a lot of people through these platforms to get the word out, for example, right, that something is happening. And it is important to information share because it is a way to help protect people people to notify them that something might be happening. But to the point that you shared, that there's not a truth verification mechanism about that, right? So there's really, the challenges are just, they're very large in terms of wanting information to get out there and also not causing widespread panic for people. And I don't know that there's a great online solution for that, but this is probably, though maybe I should be of a generation that is more pro online use and education, I think there is something to be said for going back to basics in terms of where do we invest our resources in trusted spaces, right? To Mike's point, like using our own communities to protect our own communities, and at least in the immigration context, that is like, I think, funding institutions, organizations, places that are verifiable, can provide information that maybe isn't always like the live update, on social media, but increasing resources to places in the community that are trusted where people can go. And that seems a little bit old school, but I think in a place where we are challenged by how we restrict free speech, hate speech, and misinformation, we would be wise to not forget about sort of the basics.
I'm hearing you saying that the value of trust is.
Yeah, and I just want to tee up Mari, and she had mentioned Discord servers, so I too am a parent and with a queer identity youth, and she used Discord pretty much exclusively, both to learn about herself and also to find community. And I think that actually the terms of service from Discord are pretty amazing. And then there's also sort of almost like a self-policing. I hate the word policing, sorry, I flinched, but a self-monitoring maybe piece to it that I'd love to hear more about, and to say that maybe legislators could also think about including some of the tech platform folks when we're thinking about what kind of legislation.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good thing to bring up is just that like moderating can happen on the platform itself. Like it doesn't have to, which I believe the conversation about talking with the businesses, working with the businesses as we're having like these big conversations. Part of the reason that like the shift with Meta happened was because of the government shift, and the reason because they're working so closely with each other. And so unfortunately that's not great for LGBTQ youth right now. But we are like seeing that like, moderating happens like on the Discord like server. Like the hate speech is like super monitored. The reporting is super monitored. And I don't work as closely with, that specific platform myself. But I would say that like we fact checking, that is a previously like held, like that's a feature that Meta used to have. There used to be like on the social media, like fact checking was part of the platform, and it was also removed. And so like we don't have to work against these, we don't have to work against social media when we're trying to figure out like how to make it safer. In fact, I think it should be more collaborative, and in doing that, it also has to be very collaborative with our youth and with the people who know more about the ins and outs of social media that they're using every day. So I'm sure
It
there's
sounds
more
like I think it's I started doing more user content moderation recently, and Meta's done the same, and as part of all of the very many things that were announced recently, but I think there's more details to come on what that might actually look like in practice. One last question, and if there's anything else anybody has they'd like to ask in the audience, but before getting to that last question, lunch has been moved to the Eureka room in the basement, question mark. We can continue conversations there. Yeah, sorry for the unexpected development. Last question. As an LGBTQ center, we get harassment via social media. We are told cannot remove posts, as it violates free speech and could face legal issues if we do. Is this true? How should we address this?
I don't know, I'm also gonna tee you up again to say, what's wrong with the block feature? Why can't people, just use block, mute, whatever it might be? That is an individual solution, however, so, please.
Yeah, and I think that, like, after the election, we had an influx of people who were coming on social media. Actually, there was one post of ours that got like 200 or something comments that were all just people that were posting memes and that were saying all of the negative, hate speech that, part of which I mentioned, a lot of which I can't mention. And unfortunately, like, there is this, we can limit comments for a post, or we can limit comments for all of our posts, but you can't, decide or pick who can interact. Different social medias have different features where you can only have people who follow you or can comment, but that doesn't also necessarily, like, change necessarily. Like, someone can just follow you to, post hate speech. And while blocking and muting is definitely, like, helpful, it is also, like, a pretty individual feature. And it doesn't quite hit the, like, root cause either. I think that there's a difference between, and a lot of us, are very aware of this, but there's a difference between free speech and hate speech, Like, there's a difference between, speaking your mind and speaking your views, and especially doing it in a way that, is respectful. I might have a different idea of what's considered respectful than some people. But, the hate speech is when you come in with these derogatory remarks. And I don't think that hate speech, it falls under that same category. And I think that there are pretty easy ways, like, I know that, we talk a little bit about, like, things being too vague or not specified enough, but I think it's pretty clear when someone is saying something, hateful. And I think that a lot of these platforms also are very aware of when things are hateful versus when they're just, a differing opinion, and that's why they have done the work to remove the protections, because they knew exactly when it was, one thing over the other. And so I think that by continuing to target, like, our, like, laws and legislation focusing on hate speech, that is the route to go down. And the things that are, the people that are coming in just to say, like, I disagree, you guys are all, like, the things that are not using as colorful language, perhaps, that's what I would turn to the block and the mute and the, deleting the comments and stuff, which I do a lot of, so I'm not sure if anyone else has thoughts.
Any final words? Thank you for joining us here in the chamber and online, and thank you to our panel, Dr. Sean Gamble with Stanford University School of Medicine, Wrobi with TransFamily Support Services, Jackie Gonzalez with Immigrant Defense Advocates, and Levine with John Hopkins with the School of Public Health. We're in the Eureka room now, as per the card. Thanks for being here.